commencement speaker.
I love it.
But in all seriousness, I actually grew up 15 minutes from, actually not even, like around the corner from here. I grew up in Cooper City, graduated Cooper City High back in 2011. And as a native South Floridian, it's hard not to be passionate about the ocean. You know, just to kind of take a step back, so I'll try to stay in one place.
You're good.
I like to walk around a little. But you know, really growing up here, it's hard not to be passionate about the ocean, but at the same time, you know, the platform that Evan and Andrew have built, I really admire, because oftentimes we focus so much on our work, especially in the sciences, and less on the people. And that's kind of one of our core perspectives at Seaworthy, is as much about the people as it is the solutions. But before we get to all that, you know, I really just want to share my story with all of you and kind of how we even got here before we get to all the fun stuff of what we do now. So I'll start kind of here in Cooper City and Davie. You know, at least back when I was growing up a whole, 20 years ago, it was still suburban. I feel like it's kind of starting to come up a bit more, but you know, really it was this love of the beach and Hollywood Beach specifically that was my happy place. I also became a diver in undergrad, but you know, it was just always knowing that the ocean was this place that I could get energy. At the same time, my dad was an entrepreneur as well as an engineer, and I was raised on Legos, for sure. That was something that really, although I didn't know at the time, was kind of planting a seed of being very mechanically inclined. And at the same time, really just knowing that I was capable of doing great things. You know, my dad was really, what he loved to say was, do the hard stuff and pursue your passion. And that's a theme I'll stay on today. But at the same time, my mom is a nurse, or was retired now nurse, and in the healthcare space. And so I kind of had this balance of very practical, logical brain and empathy and caretaker as parents. But when I was 13, they divorced, and I'm also an only child. And so very early on in life, I kind of got this just reality check of kind of what is fair and not in life, in terms of knowing that at the end of the day, you know, I was kind of the one, just the one buffer in between, right? And that there's a theme that I've had where a lot kind of falls on my shoulders, and you either have a choice of kind of sitting in the misery or woe of, you know, of what's on your plate, or you know, the only way out is through. And that will also be a theme I'll touch on more. But you know, after I graduated high school, I went off to University of Florida, where I studied mechanical engineering. During my freshman year, I started actually my first week of college. Technically, I studied environmental engineering, and then basically at convocation, I heard the dean of the environmental engineering school talk about water pollution and waste management, and I was like, not for me. So I shifted into mechanical engineering. I was thinking about alternative energy and just ways that I could make some sort of impact. It really actually, I guess, beyond just my love of the beach, started in high school. I took AP Environmental Science and Marine Science. That also was kind of this, just real aha moment of, okay, I know this is where I need to be. But I also knew I had an engineering brain. Math and science was my thing. Chemistry was definitively not. That's part of why I shifted to mechanical engineering. I said I was Chem 1 and done. But really, you know, getting into mechanical engineering, I knew I wanted to do something environmental. I didn't know exactly what. And then at the end of my freshman year, spring of 2012, James Cameron did the dive to the Marianas Trench, you may recall. And that was really my big aha moment, where I was like, oh my God, you could do technology and innovation, explore the ocean. But more importantly, just that it was really understanding how we're so biased towards space and land, and we don't see the oceans as this opportunity. We've explored more of the moon and Mars than we have our own oceans, and at the same time, the ocean is the greatest carbon sink, heat sink on the planet. You know, it is, every other breath you breathe is because of the ocean. And so, you know, it blew my mind that no one saw it as an asset or as a career path. And you know, when I talk about mechanical engineering, most of my colleagues wanted to go work at SpaceX or NASA, right? And they looked at me as crazy when I was like, well, why not the ocean? And so in college, I really was, you know, trying to figure out, okay, I've had this aha moment. How do I get on this path? I ended up getting to robotics. So I started, actually, my first project was a tailgating robot, which at UF, the Gators, we called it a tailgater. And it was actually designed to autonomously flip burgers. I get to say mechanically it worked. Electrical engineers, anyway. College students, we get to mess things up, and thankfully on a shoestring budget. But you know, it helped me start to just prove to myself, right, that I could build things and kind of see projects through. And when we talk about the entrepreneurial mindset, I think a lot of people get caught up in business as the primary vehicle. But you know, entrepreneurial mindset is so much more than that. It's really about, you know, how are you just taking ownership of something, making it your own, and going for it. And so I ended up becoming president of the robotics club at UF, which started to help me realize my own leadership potential. And then I got into, there's a leadership society called Engineering Leadership Circle that essentially was kind of a retirement community for engineering leaders at UF. I didn't make that up, they said that. And so when I got into that, my junior year, fall of my junior year, that spring, the president had to step down, and no one wanted to step up because it wasn't a very well-respected organization, despite having some of the top talent in the engineering school. And I volunteered as tribute and basically was like, you know, we actually have an opportunity to do something really great here if we leverage our collective potential. And so we shifted that organization into actually how do we help mentor future leaders in the College of Engineering at UF. But arguably what really helped me get on my path in undergrad was kind of two key experiences. So there was this exploration of my potential, but also just really working to validate my passion. And so I got to intern at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. But before I get to the actual internship, I think how I got there is really important. So the ocean space, and you heard also in my bio, like there are so many barriers to participation in what we call the blue economy or the ocean economy, but really ocean impact on a broader scale. And so when I was hoping to work at Woods Hole, which if you're not familiar with Woods Hole, they're the organization that founded Titanic, arguably helped invent marine robotics. I, frankly was competing with students from MIT, which they have a joint graduate program with for ocean engineering. FAU actually as well, if you didn't know, they have the oldest ocean engineering degree, which if I could do it all over again, I might have gone there, but Gainesville was my happy place. But really the journey to get there was seeing not only the competition, but also just kind of the scrappiness. Out of the 30, the internship program is called the Summer Student Fellowship, and out of the 30 fellows, only 3 of them were actually in engineering. And so I had to, basically figure out how the heck did past interns get this. So I reached out to a student from Princeton who had interned the summer before me, and I was like, tell me how you did this. I need to work here. And basically she suggested reaching out to researchers, and I ended up reaching out to like 20 or 30, which whittled down to 6, which whittled down to 2. And so this started in October of 2013, and basically by the time I got to those 2 in January of 2014, we ended up having to build a whole proposal. It's the most overbearing internship application ever. But bottom line, I ended up being like a fifth alternative intern, so didn't end up getting it. So then followed up an additional 2 months to finally get an offer for literally a temporary job that didn't exist as my internship. 7 months of follow-up all in all from October to May, and literally moving 2 weeks after I found out. So that's kind of when we talk about persistence, and I'll drop kind of nuggets of my wisdom. I don't want to be too egotistical about it, but just things I've learned. It really was this persistence that paid off, and in terms of not only networking, but also just in showing the eagerness and willingness to do the work. So after that internship, it was everything, honestly, I could hope for. I worked with a guy who was a PhD at MIT, and I don't know if there are any Jimmy Neutron fans, but if you ever saw in Jimmy Neutron the professor who couldn't finish his sentences, he was that guy. I kid you not. I literally would finish his sentences. Brilliant guy. Love working with him. I was doing a autonomous underwater vehicle, or we say AUV, that was vertically profiling layers of the ocean, sucking in microbes to sequence their RNA. I don't do the biology stuff, but I was doing hydrodynamics work, and just like this. Still to this day, the work I was doing as a 21-year-old was the most technically challenging work I ever did in the field. And then the other person I ended up working with is now actually an astronaut in training at NASA. So just incredible people. And so I was like, this is where I want to end up, like absolutely the dream. So I get back to college, my senior year at UF, and I started the Marine Technology Society at UF. And that was arguably, even though I had done 2 prior leadership positions, that was really where I kind of started to find my entrepreneurial spark. Starting an organization from scratch, selling people on a vision for something that didn't exist at UF. There was no ocean engineering degree. And maybe I got like 10, 20 people tops through the year. But at the same time, and actually I want to zoom out of these underlying themes, like there was this need to kind of build the uncharted path, right? Like there was no pathway of students from UF going to places like Woods Hole, right? It's FAU, MIT, UC, San Diego, pretty much those were like the feeder schools because they had these specialized programs that there are maybe a handful of in the US. And so, when we think about, one of the themes you'll hear is these barriers to participation and, following your passion. It's really, being mindful of things like when I was at UF, the student government wouldn't give first-year organizations any money to help build themselves until they'd proven themselves. But I was graduating that year, right? So, part of this is really just being aware and challenging a lot of these either unnecessary or really, obstacles that people are building, these barriers. So to wrap up my UF career and then start getting into the professional side, really this Marine Technology Society started my entrepreneurial journey and helped me, most importantly, earn this opportunity to be both a University Innovation Fellow. And when I talk about the things that have actually most seeded my journey, it was this experience. It was actually my last semester of undergrad. And, Evan touched on this, and it's really true. When you find these communities and opportunities that can inspire you and help you realize things about yourself that you didn't even know, that's really, I think, where, you not only want to stay connected, but want to just drill down into. And so basically for me, this University Innovation Fellowship was an opportunity not only to learn design and systems thinking, which just by show of hands, anyone know design thinking? At 30, awesome. If you don't know, just look up the Stanford D School. They have some great resources online. It's all about empathy-driven problem solving and how are we actually creating a process that's both human-centered and really thinking about things both on the micro level of your individual experience, but also on the bigger picture. And as I get to my career, you'll see that in action. But really, more importantly, beyond just the skills it taught me, was it introduced me to a community of people in innovation and entrepreneurship that I didn't even realize were my people. As soon as I got on campus at the Stanford D School, it was just, my brain was in overdrive. And still to this day, some of my best friends are from that program. One of them specifically built this wall of opportunity, which was a few years later I participated in, and actually where I first wrote down the idea for Seaworthy. But really, just most importantly, it was the way I kind of phrased it was I got to surround myself with people that lit the fire under my ass to want to do more, honestly. And people that got not just plugging into the corporate, not to be existential, but machine. When I went to career fair at UF, right? I stood in an hour in line to talk to Lockheed Martin, thinking that was the dream to work with these big defense companies, right? Which doing honorable work, and they ended up working in defense, but at the same time, when you talk about creating an impact and making a difference on the oceans and climate change, that's not where the opportunity is, right? And so we often, even as students, we don't challenge the pathways that we're being fed into, and we just kind of innately trust that schools are taking us down the right path. But at the end of the day, we need to be kind of critically thinking throughout our journeys. So let me now get to the real world. So after I graduated, my first job was at Bluefin Robotics, but similarly to my experience with Woods Hole, I actually graduated before I even had the job offer. I won a leadership award for my graduation, and like everyone else who won awards already had either an offer for grad school at MIT or working at a Fortune 500 company, and I was like, I'm still trying to find my way into this field because there's so few opportunities. And I even had someone I interned with he was an employee at Woods Hole, not an intern, but someone I worked with there who literally said, "Oh, just sell out and go work for this software company." And I was like, absolutely not. And so even to this day, one of my other like top tips of if you don't use LinkedIn, it's a great resource. And also, I think one of the few platforms in social media that actually allows for storytelling and some version of authenticity. But really, I found I had someone from Bluefin Robotics, which ended up being my first employer, viewed my profile on LinkedIn, and I was just like, hey, like, would love to work there. They were at the time kind of known as like the chop shop, or I don't know if you ever watched that custom motorcycle company, Orange County Choppers. Yeah. Like it was like that for autonomous underwater vehicles. They did a bunch of like one-offs. They were the ones who were out searching for MH370, the flight in Malaysia that went down, which, fun fact, my coworker was like 3 months into the job before I got sent out there for another 3 months. But basically, it was one of these dream jobs. I was like, okay, I'm going to be a mechanical engineer there, design these, it'll be great. And basically, I went through like 3 rounds of interviews, did a 3 or 4 hour video interview back before Zoom was even a thing. And all signs were I got the job. Then they totally ghosted me for like 3 weeks. And I followed up my contacts at Woods Hole and I was like, is there any opportunities to come back? They offered me a return internship even though I graduated. And so I used it as leverage and ended up getting a different job offer at Bluefin, because what I didn't know is they actually had a hiring freeze because they were preparing to sell the company, which I'll get to that in a moment. But basically I got hired on instead to be a marine operations engineer, which basically meant pilot and test engineer for these multi-million-dollar underwater robots. And also, let's take a step back. So culturally, being here in South Florida, it is definitely diverse and warm. I then moved to Boston and got to work winters at sea, not feeling my fingers, but I loved the work. It was really, very different challenge. I still say Woods Hole is the most technically challenging, but Bluefin, I had to think on my feet. It was literally learning how to, I learned Linux. I had to learn how to literally get a 3,000-pound robot out of the water. I can maybe pull up pictures later, but basically it was like both kind of dirty work, literally working on deck, but most importantly, really learning to just think on my feet and act fast. And if any of you know anything about Boston culture, they're not ones to really ease you into things. My first boss would waste no time in telling me when I fucked up, but I maybe heard good job once over my 2 years there. It was not a healthy work environment. And then just in general, work-life balance as a concept there, I was working 60 to 80 hours a week. I was on call. My dad had helped put things in perspective, where he worked at IBM for his first job, and he said he was working just as hard. And he said, you got to do what you got to do to find your way. And so I didn't question it, dedicated myself. But about 6 months into working there, they got bought out by a defense contractor called General Dynamics, submarine makers. And immediately I was like, okay, well, this is not not the long-term option. In some ways to me it was like selling out. And so I already started to say like how at the end of the day it was one of the few. It was kind of a startup. It was like I was employee number 100, but it was really one of the few companies that hadn't been a part of the defense or fossil fuel industry. And so I just saw one of those last opportunities evaporate. But I obviously I was 6 months into my first job out of college, so I had to stick around. I ended up becoming the lead test engineer / pilot of a underwater mine hunting robot called Knifefish. And basically, the true story is the Navy still uses to this day mine hunting dolphins to find underwater mines, which obviously PETA, anyone with a conscience, not a great thing. So we were building the replacement to that. I will say I have my own theories on how bad that sonar is for actual dolphins, but all that to be said, we were at least trying to build that technology, and I was literally on the ground level of what technology literally the company was acquired for. which was really cool. But at the same time, as time went on, I also saw how unsustainable it was personally, beyond just the hours, just culturally. My first boss was a complete, if you know the term, masshole. It's people from Massachusetts who are assholes to everyone equally. That justifies them being an asshole, apparently. I still don't get it. But at the same time, it was really, just this kind of point of starting to learn to value my time. They were very abusive of your personal life, and frankly, my one childhood best friend thankfully lived in Boston, but I really didn't build a life up there otherwise. But as I was really navigating this on the other side, my dad had actually started a new business back in 2014, 2015. It was a franchise of a corporation that was doing electronics restoration locally here in South Florida. And I knew he was struggling with it. It wasn't going well. He wasn't receiving very much support from the franchisor that he purchased the franchise from. And, especially it is May and Mental Health Awareness Month, which good coincidence we had this instead of World Oceans Day next month, because this is truly one of my biggest passions also. And so, my dad's struggle as an entrepreneur, which, most entrepreneurs don't even talk about mental health when the stat is over 70% of entrepreneurs deal with mental health challenges. Entrepreneurship is one of the most mentally unhealthy things you can do, honestly. It's not even a joke, unfortunately. It really is. I mean, just even my own experience, but also my dad's, you literally, when you don't have a guaranteed paycheck, when you don't know what's coming, there's no sense of stability, and especially for some people, sinking their life savings into something and see it evaporate, right? It's just, it literally eats at your confidence, your identity. Entrepreneurship is very much this kind of very gray area of personal and professional, right? It's hard to distinguish. And then I call people in business my friends, like Steve Carell. But all that to say, I saw my dad really just struggle. And, I was working 60 to 80 hours a week. The last time I'd seen him as we got into 2016, I hadn't seen him since November of 2015. And I was finally planning to see him for Father's Day of 2016. It had been over 6 months since I had a chance to see him, because we were both just working our tails off. And I knew his business was struggling. I knew he was struggling personally. I planned to go home for Father's Day, and of course work called in, and I had to push it back to July 4th. And, I remember when I called him for Father's Day and he got my card, he was literally crying because of how meaningful it was just for him to have something that helped him break out of the darkness for a little bit. But the week that followed that, I was wrapping up a 3-week stint of testing multiple underwater vehicles back to back. We were working again crazy hours. It was actually one of the most probably fun projects I got to work on. It was literally sending 2 vehicles past each other and seeing if they could detect each other and not ram into each other. But at the same time, I was, just barely getting by as far as just work was everything. And on the last day of the 3 weeks straight of testing, I got the call that my dad committed suicide. And obviously, that changed a lot. I immediately had to learn how to prioritize my own mental health and not repeat, the path that he went down. I had to learn how to get rebuild my life as a 23-year-old, and also handle an estate as an only child. I also had to try to figure out, make someone in Boston realize what empathy was, but more importantly, just, find the strength to persevere. It's not something that obviously anyone can prepare for, but as I've gotten older, I've also realized that, not only is it a disease, but it's also, at the end of the day, the end of someone suffering. And, one of the hardest things about it is, a lot of people carry guilt, and how do you let go of that and realize at the end of the day, I was doing everything that he wanted for me and wanted me to do. And so I was at peace with that. But took obviously a lot of time. And so, that was just this critical moment in my life that I saw things were much bigger than just pursuing your passion, right? And that, at the end of the day, there is this need to balance your life with your passion. And from that, I obviously not only was catalyzed to try to start to change after obviously taking some time, but changed my situation. I ended up applying for a PhD at Georgia Tech. I applied for a job in San Diego, and miraculously, so that was June of 2016 when I lost my dad, and by February of the year following, I miraculously had, within 2 weeks of each other, the offer for a job as a Navy contractor in San Diego and a PhD at Georgia Tech. And after going to San Diego and having a guaranteed full-time job that I ensured had work-life balance, that was my biggest condition. And they thought I was lazy as a result, but they didn't know. I ended up getting that job moving out there in 2017. And when we talk about, again, this kind of shift, like I was working for the Navy, it wasn't where my passion was, but it enabled me to rebuild my foundation. Honestly, one of, and I'm sure there are multiple goal-driven people in this room, I still was pursuing, my passion. I was actually applying, my biggest goal was actually to end up at UCSD and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography out there. And at the same time, the first thing I did when I got to San Diego was start therapy, which, was changed my life. It really helped me to overcome everything I'd been through, but most importantly, just helped me rebuild myself. Because my dad was the person I identified most with in the world and was my best friend and mentor. And, it was something that I had to learn to be proud of myself, to learn to, support myself through this journey. Because at the end of the day, especially in entrepreneurship, and especially for solo founders, it's it can be a lonely journey. Thankfully, being an only child prepared me for a lot of this. But yeah, so all that to be said, San Diego was really this opportunity for me to rebuild and reinvest in myself, but also continue to pursue my passion kind of in the background. I will say the first 2 years still was pretty dark. I not only ended up working in a job that was really a glorified technician role rather than an engineering role, which basically meant I wasn't using much of my brain, I was just turning screws, but it was what it was. I was at least getting off at normal hours, but I knew I wasn't fulfilled. And basically, I had applied to UCSD, first year got rejected, applied again, the second year got rejected. Just saw kind of that opportunity that I envisioned in San Diego starting to evaporate. And luckily, halfway through, after my first year and a half, I got switched to a new project, which was the first time I actually got to use my engineering degree since I graduated in its traditional sense. I shifted to a new project where I was 3D printing parts and helping to, I can't talk about everything I did with the Navy, unfortunately, but it was probably the most fulfilling job I had had as far as actually using what I tried, studied for and put the work into. But again, I knew it wasn't my passion. And throughout all this time, I go back to the University Innovation Fellowship. I actually mentored students for 5 years following my graduation, all the way up to 2020. And I, stayed connected with this community. And after my second rejection from UCSD in 2019, I actually also had the opportunity to mentor 50 students from Latin America for the University Innovation Fellows Program, and get invited to speak at their summit at Stanford and Google in Silicon Valley. And it was actually the first time I got to share the story about my dad, and just help people kind of challenge their preconceived notions on work-life balance, pursuing your passion and all that. But more importantly, it gave me this kind of opportunity to recenter and think about what I wanted. And as I mentioned, one of my best friends there had this opportunity wall. And this whole time so this is the design thinking part. I saw my experience as someone who had the pedigree or luxury of working at Woods Hole, who had 5 years of experience from piloting, testing, and operating, designing unmanned underwater vehicles. Couldn't find an opportunity to make an impact, right? Basically, my career options were continuing in the defense space, take a 40% pay cut for the hopes of working at an oceanographic research institution, which ultimately the folks I wanted to work with at that institution were still in and out of my lab on the Navy base. So I was not even actually able to escape that vacuum. And then the last piece is, working in the fossil fuel sector, which of course I refuse to do. And so, it was this kind of like, critical moment of taking myself out of my own shoes while putting others in my shoes and saying, if I can't have this opportunity as someone with all this experience, with the, Woods Hole stamp on my resume, how is someone without that ever supposed to have that opportunity? How is someone with socioeconomic disadvantages going to have that opportunity? How is anyone supposed to just make a difference in this space? We're promised opportunity. I mean, my generation, we're raised on this theory of pursue your passion and the opportunity will be there. And in the ocean space could not be fundamentally more wrong. And I'll get to my master's in a moment, but really, I just was at this crossroads where I was like, I know this is my community, and there's no community like this in the ocean space, and also in the innovation and entrepreneurship space, that is. And also just that, how do we create this other path, right? It can't just be academia, research, private sector, which is just fossil fuels and defense. There has to be something else if we're actually going to make an impact. And I had no experience in the startup space, but I just knew this path had to be built because I knew I was far from alone. And so going into 2020, I kind of saw this opportunity to, actually it was really summer of 2019 even, I saw the opportunity to start thinking about what would it look like. I don't know if anyone's familiar with like startup incubators or accelerators, but I saw that model and was like, okay, this is kind of it. Although, again, what background do I have to support startups when I don't have entrepreneurial experience previously? And so really, I just started business planning. Fun fact is the original concept for Seaworthy was actually called Rising Tide, and I made a logo with an upside down anchor, and I thought it was the coolest thing. And then when I showed my friends, everyone was like, why is the anchor up the wrong way? And then years later in San Francisco, I saw a Jean-Georges restaurant with that exact logo, and I was like, I was right. Anyway, but all that to be said, I started working on the business plan in 2019. My routine in San Diego, which actually is a really important point. After my second rejection from CSD, it was the first time I had to just let go of having a goal, right, and just like enjoy life for a year and be a 20-something-year-old. And that was a great year. I did Coachella, and, all the things. Anyway, I'm not gonna get into that. But all of that to be said, I really just was like, this is my time to invest in the things I want to put energy into because I can't, I don't have the opportunity to pursue my passion. And so every Sunday I would start the morning at my favorite coffee shop around the block, work on my business plan for a couple hours, go play beach volleyball, and then have a jam session with my band, and maybe a grill out at the end of the night. It was great, but I knew I was working towards something more. And so going into 2020, I applied to UCSD for the third time, just out of spite because I knew I wasn't getting in, but also applied to for my master's in ocean exploration science. And I was like, if I don't get into as a gator, I will be very depressed. But all that to be said, I did get the offer in January of 2020, and March 5th, which is actually my birthday, that was my 27th birthday, I accepted, and I was like, all right, I'm going to Miami, I figured it out, I have my business plan, I'm going to launch when I get there, build the community, it's going to be great. Of course, a week later, COVID hit, and everything went to shit. And so, it was this kind of moment of like, all right, I literally put in my notice that day, and then basically revoked it. And I was like, all right, I got to figure out what the hell I'm doing. And, I sat on it and I'm like, look, like I could, it's easy to stay here, it's comfortable, and obviously the lowest risk. But at the same time, I'm 27. I know I was 27. I don't have much more of a window that I see myself taking a risk like this. And my master's is kind of like my safety net. That's the way I viewed it. And actually, the key point of the master's program that I did, it was called a Master's of Professional Science. So it wasn't a thesis-driven master's. It was actually, you had to do an internship for it. And so when I applied, I said, I'm going to intern for myself and do two birds, one stone. And that was my condition to accept. And so after they verified that, I accepted, even doing primarily virtual studies, although I did get to become a scientific diver and do some cool stuff in person. But I just really saw this opportunity to come back to South Florida to not only build this community for ocean innovation, but really create an ecosystem. And for those who don't know what that means, it's really not just the nature-based ecosystem that you're surrounded with here, but actually an ecosystem for innovation, right? Again, when I look at the field of what we say blue tech or ocean innovation, the opportunity to do this kind of work never existed here outside of cruise industry and shipping. And it's, when I say that, usually I get confused looks like that. I'm like, it makes no sense. We should have had that, we're surrounded by water. It should be a thing here. But the reality is, it all gets fed into this self-perpetuating system. So now to get to my master's. So basically, I did this ocean exploration science master's, and very quickly saw, this final reinforcement of what I like to call my jadedness, or basically my systems view of the ocean sciences space, where, really there was this kind of feeder into, either going to academia or going into research or public sector, and that was really it. And so, I just saw this kind of unchallenged, again, path that people were getting put on, where there were literally less opportunities than there were degrees. And so I, when I launched Seaworthy, I was recruiting students and trying to help assemble our volunteers, but really most importantly, just starting to educate people on this other path. And so we had these panels where we'd feature experts in my network, from Woods Hole to folks who graduated my program, just to at least show, like, hey, we can build this credibility and start building this community. And fast forward to 2021, as actually the year ended in 2020, I discovered this model called the Venture Studio. And I was also doing a lot of virtual networking, as we all were during COVID, and really learned about this regenerative movement as well. So regenerative means going beyond sustainability to actually solve problems at its root, because sustainability is very much about mitigation, which for the oceans we are far past. There's less than 10% of the reef cover left. It's not really anything left to sustain. We need to think bigger. But on the other side is, as a social construct, how do we create this accessible opportunity for people to actually do the work, right? And again, it doesn't really exist in the system that currently is there. So this venture studio model essentially was, how do we co-create startups and democratize that opportunity? And so that was really where we started. We ended up having 150 people apply for our first cohort, and at the same time had early stage startups coming to us saying, we need support too. And so we ended up having both this combination of co-created startups and early stage startups, and staying more on the personal than professional today, but I'll just summarize in saying we ended up supporting 20 startups over the last 2 years, and at the same time really just helped establish Miami as this blue tech hub, to the point that we're now part of this 1,000 Ocean Startups Coalition of all leading incubators, accelerators, and investors globally in the ocean space. But more importantly, just showing that it's not just people that look like me that are doing this work. There was one woman on my team of 25 when I worked for the Navy. It was stark, and by the way, she left the team because she was uncomfortable. And so, there's really an interesting demographic shift when you put the word tech in front of something, because the marine sciences is actually primarily women, but blue tech is primarily male. So all that to say, it was really, how do we drive the social impact to enable economic impact that results in environmental impact? So, and that's really kind of the core of our work, and really our mission is to drive access and inclusion in innovation for ocean and climate impact. So, okay, I'm gonna wrap up with this. I brought a list, I wanted to make sure I covered everything. So basically, to kind of summarize my journey and bring us to a close here, I kind of listed my top 5 wisdoms, if you will, which, some of it I covered, some of it maybe I didn't, but the first one gets back to what my dad always said, which is pursue your passion and do the hard stuff, right? If it was easy, everyone would be doing it. The hard stuff is really the most rewarding, because you get to, for me, my deepest validation, my deepest fulfillment is, I say, being a facilitator of facilitators, like helping others who help grander scale impact. As far as the problem that you are pursuing, right? I think it's really important to be authentic, relatable, and have a unique perspective, right? even though when I talk about design thinking, systems thinking, and oceans, it seems like these kind of big concepts, at the end of the day, when you identify these barriers for people, it becomes instantly relatable because they've written off this opportunity to be part of a field that, frankly, we need all different kind of backgrounds and disciplines in. And so, finding that kind of cross-section of what is your kind of way that you think with what is the problem you're passionate about, and at the same time representing that in a way that's true to you. Thirdly, intentionality. I kind of have a couple times, every year I try to have like one word that I center around. 2021, that word was intentionality. And what that meant for us was really that just because you build it doesn't mean that that the opportunities you create reach the people that can benefit the most, right? How do you actually be intentional in building out those partnerships, creating an inclusive community, and finding the people that can most benefit from your work? My intention for this year and kind of shift as I've gone along is being inclusive but discerning. That is my latest kind of mantra, where you're doing what's needed but not necessarily what's expected of you, right? And how do you balance wanting to support everyone doing great work but really understand that you can't help everyone and you need to be aligned with strategically the most valuable opportunities. And then the last thing is that to stay true to your values while having confidence in your value. I think that's something that, when I look at who we work with as the entrepreneur we support, it's so much less about the technology, because if someone's not moldable, well, they won't be successful, right? And if they do end up being successful, it's probably not going to make sense. And so, value-driven entrepreneurship is something that I really preach. We have our values on our website. I won't want to relist them now. But it's something that I really think is critical as you think about going through life and taking on big problems. And the last thing I'll just say is that everyone has something to contribute. And when I get back to all this, I love frameworks and ways of thinking, but at the end of the day, we just have to start thinking critically about ourselves and what we think we're capable of, because oftentimes we put ourselves in boxes that are literally our own self-perpetuated prisons. And so when we start thinking outside that of what we're capable of, and knowing that degrees or professions are just constructs, and that especially entrepreneurship, you get to play with those and free yourself of those limitations. And so if you've ever, or if you are considering either a shift, I know we've had a lot of shifts in the professional world over the last few years. I encourage you to continue to pursue it and maybe think differently about yourself, but also just about how you create that pathway for yourself that could also be for others.